Hello, freaks, and welcome to Radical Research. That's Anacrusis from their 1988 debut, Suffering Hour, and a song called Frigid Bitch. And this is Radical Research, episode 34. How about that?
I mean, that is, I was almost going to say that it borders on early sadist levels of mania, but I think it competes with it pretty heartily, actually.
Sure.
That is just, balls out madness.
I think the reason we picked it is because it's not exactly typical of Anacrusis. Certainly, Suffering Hour is their rawest, most vicious album, without any doubt. And Frigid Bitch stands out even amongst that crowd. So I love it. And then we're talking about Anacrusis, obviously. This is a St. Louis band. Their discography ranges from 88 to 93. We're going to cover all four albums, and then a little postscript that happened just a few years ago. I don't know what your introduction to Anacrusis is actually, but and we'll talk about that in a second. I do remember, even though there was a lot of hype on their Annihilation Complete demo in like 87, like when I was starting to read fanzines and everything, this tape was apparently in a lot of people's tape decks. People were talking very highly about this obscure Midwest band. And I was doing some tape trading at that time, but it was all I could do to really keep up with the album releases happening in 86, 87.
Yeah.
Just a lot coming at you, and I was trying to keep up on it all. So anyway, that tape at that time slipped me by. But when I saw Suffering Hour in a record store in Iowa City in 1988, I got it immediately, and I loved it immediately. I mean, it was raw and feral, but it also had this hint of sophistication, and their twist on this like super aggressive thrash sound was interesting. It was unique, and you could tell they were going to expand their sound. You could tell that this was really not where they were going to stay, right. Feet planted firmly in this kind of material. I also was a bit intrigued by something on the back. I think even before I listened to it and got it home, I remember reading this, and it said, thank you to our 5 biggest influences or something. And those influences were Metallica, Slayer, Metal Church, Trouble, and Pink Floyd.
There you go.
And I think at the time, something like Pink Floyd certainly stuck out. Like, oh, that's interesting.
Even, notion of a band being influenced equally by Slayer and Trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some slower, more morose moments that recall Trouble, I suppose, on Suffering Hour. But I'd say Trouble and Pink Floyd are in the peripheral view of Suffering Hour, as opposed to the other three, which you can kind of see. You can the energy and the sort of riff of mania of Metal Church is there. Slayer, you hear it all over Frigid Bitch, so no need to explain there. And I think Metallica was just an influence on nearly everybody playing this kind of stuff back then. So,
and one of the things that distinguishes the first two Anacrusis records for me too is the fact that they tuned down their guitars. So there was a dimension of heaviness there that you didn't get with a lot of thrash.
Yeah, they were definitely on the heavier end of the spectrum, and you're right, they were detuning. What was your introduction? I'm assuming it wasn't Suffering Hour.
No, I mean, dude, when I was in the second grade, I was just raging constantly. When I got into metal in '91, there was this place in Statesboro called Peppermint Records, and Peppermint.
Yeah, you mentioned this. We talked about it in the old episode.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, it had a really, really robust selection of underground metal. It was crazy. Thinking about it now is even crazier, really. And I was really into death metal. And some of the guys that worked at the store were into death metal too, but they were largely guys that had been into thrash and just kind of kept up. And they were very enthusiastic about sort of the mutations and the post-thrash iterations that were happening. And this guy, Mickey, who managed the store, I would always go in and I would say, Mickey, what do I need to check out? And he's like, are you ready for something really different? And, sure. And he's like, you got to buy Manic Impressions. And so I bought it. And I didn't get it at first. And we'll get into this in a little bit. There's no metal record that sounds anything like Manic Impressions. And in terms of the production, but just the general approach. But over time, it just stuck with me. And then Screams and Whispers came out and just completely blew me away. And then I really kind of that sort of reflected back on Manic Impressions and helped me to appreciate that even more. And then I got Reason after that. And then I got Suffering Hour much later, late 90s, early 2000s. I grabbed a vinyl copy on eBay.
Were you a little surprised when you heard Suffering Hour?
Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't I didn't intentionally not get it, but I was so caught up in other things. And then at some point I was like, man, I should probably have the first Anacrusis record. Oh yeah. I was stunned by it, in fact.
Yeah. And it's funny. I was going to say earlier that, even though that demo was highly touted and, there were pockets of people, of course, writing about them with great emotion, and you could tell people really love the band. But on the whole, at the time, they were never really as cool or as talked about or as visible as a Destruction or a Dark Angel or any of those up and coming thrash bands from 87, 88, that, things were really starting to kind of get swept up in the wake of the big four.
Right.
And they always were seemingly this sort of odd band out, this kind of left field band. One of those bands that maybe not quite as much as Voivod, but they'd get that thing where, it's too weird for me,
Right.
You'd get that. But certainly I think Suffering Hour can run with the best of them in, just in straight up, messed up, fuck your head up thrash. Yet at the same time, they had songs like Present Tense that we're going to listen to a snippet of that opens the album, actually, that went a little further. So let's see if we hear it. This is from Suffering Hour 1988, Present Tense.
A lot to process there.
Yeah, and it's funny because that opens the album. You know, this is what they give you. So clearly they were pretty ambitious from the beginning.
For sure. And we'll talk about this more in a bit, and we'll hear a lot more of it. But Ken Nardi is definitely one of thrash metal's most extraordinary vocalists.
Oh, no doubt.
And like the guy, I don't know that. I think about guys like Keith Dean, you know, but like in terms of like sheer dynamics, I don't know that Ken Nardi's even rivaled, really. And like his screech, you think like Danny Filth and guys like Adam from Alchemist owe him a deep debt of gratitude.
Yeah, that's a really good call. That squeal is just unmatched, unbelievable.
It really is.
And definitely a precursor to those guys.
Oh, yep. For sure. And too, like I think you can hear a band that has suckled at the teat of Noise Records too, because you hear, you know, Voivod's cosmic overtones. I think you can hear some of the dark drama of Celtic Frost, among a lot of other things. But I mean, you know, those bands are sort of lodestars for any metal band that's looking to sort of expand its horizons.
And I like that despite Suffering Hours' aggression and manic intensity, that, you know, you can already hear this band sort of blossoming, and they won't be staying here very long.
No,
but that's why I'm glad for Suffering Hour too, because it's really one of my favorites actually, and because of that reason, it's so singular in their discography, and I love the intensity. We talked about Ken Nardi. We'll talk about him a lot throughout this episode. Fair to say that he was kind of the guiding light in a lot of ways. He always produced the albums except for Suffering Hour, which is credited to the band and a guy named J.J. Johnson, whoever that is. You can call me Ray, you can call me Jay. I don't know. Hats off to J.J. Johnson for giving this album the extremely raw basement edge it has. I love it. But no, he was instrumental, obviously, in the writing and the producing. Then we have Kevin Heidbreder, who was the second guitarist, a very accomplished musician as well. John Emery on bass. We will talk a lot about the bass role in Anacrusis as we get into the other albums, certainly.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's all over those, and he's got his own style and sound.
And then a full slew of really cool, interesting drummers.
Well, that's just it. They were one of these bands that always had that one position that was never filled permanently, always kind of shifting, kind of that revolving door thing. Yeah, they were one of those. And we had Mike Owen on their first two albums. That's present tense. And let's listen to another pretty great moment from Suffering Hour. This is Fighting Evil. Yeah. Again, we got to talk about Ken Nardi. Here's something that he doesn't definitely get enough credit for, and that's the harsh melodic vocal duality or dichotomy thing. A lot of people like to point to like Burton Bell of Fear Factory for sort of originating that, or, if you want to get crafty, maybe Snake from Voivod, maybe Keith Dean from Holy Terror, but those guys they didn't quite have that black and white dichotomy to it, right? For all the credit Burton Bell seems to get for sort of bringing that into metal, Ken Nardi absolutely brought that in before.
Absolutely. That actually struck me while I was listening, in preparation for the episode, as how truly innovative this was. It's a great, and you're right on the money, because Burton Bell does tend to be the guy that gets the credit for that.
I think so. Yeah, and there are other examples throughout metal's history, certainly in the 80s, where you had guys.
I guess Quorthon.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, when you're talking about sort of every song and you're getting kind of a clean vocal in that song and a harsh one, Bathory didn't do that quite as often. Like he might do it on one or two songs on, say, Blood, Fire, Death. But yeah, where it's consistent and where it's just very much sort of this Siamese twin, role that it has, where it's sort of like offsetting the other. I think Ken Nardi deserves actually more credit than Burton Bell. Not that I want to take anything away from him. I dig the first Fear Factory, and I love where that sits in metal history. But sorry, Burton.
Yeah, this is not your evening. Can I take us off track real quick?
Yeah, of course.
I want to go back to like my origin story with Anacrusis. There is one very formative thing that I forgot to mention. And you may know this thing, given your ridiculously encyclopedic metal knowledge. You probably do. It was this weird video compilation called Video Sheet Metal. Do you know this?
Oh, sheet metal. I know a lot about sheet metal. I have a different story.
So, all right. So it was this VHS, and I was on vacation at a beach in, I think it was in St. Simons, Georgia, in 1990, summer of 1991. And I picked this thing up, and it had it's the weirdest damn thing. It had Pantera. That was the first time I ever heard Pantera. Death Angel, Soul Asylum, the Black Crowes. Not sure how they fit into all this. This really terrible band called Coup de Grace. Had Trouble. It was the first time I ever heard Trouble. I had Jane's Addiction, Soundgarden, but I had Anacrusis. And I remember watching it and being like super impressed.
Yeah.
And they were just seemed like really cool guys too, to boot.
It was interview footage?
It was interview and live footage. And it wasn't even just interview footage. It was these hanging out at the house with these guys.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, Sheet Metal was a fanzine, and it was run by this guy named Jake Wisely. And the reason I know that, I mean, that would be ridiculous if it was just some fanzine, and I don't know every fanzine.
I would not put that past you, by the way.
Well, right, but and I know some, but I don't know all of them. The reason I know this so well is because it was just something I picked up at the very same store actually that I bought Suffering Hour. They had a bunch of zines, and I would often buy the ones that looked interesting. And Sheet Metal was one of those. I remember they had Realm on the cover of one of their.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, exactly. So, and they were Midwest. They were, I think it was Minneapolis. So. And their zines would cover the gamut. I mean, there was an article on Adrian Belew in one of the later Sheet Metals. There was an article on, like you said, Jane's Addiction. They really didn't have that sort of more narrow focus that a lot of the metal zines did at the time. So you would see things, they were big proponents of Voivod and Anacrusis and all that, Mind Over 4. And I was starting to get into writing for fanzines at the time, and I wrote to Jake, and I wrote a few things. One of my very first interviews I ever did was with Crimson Glory, John Drenning. And Sheet Metal ran that.
Nice. I didn't know that.
Yeah. That was one of the things I got started with. I mean, wrote all terrible stuff because I just didn't know what I was doing. But it was a cool start, and I appreciated Jake. And then later, Jake was one of the founders of Red Decibel, the label, and that was the label that had Coup de Grace you mentioned, Rapscallion, Fat Tuesday. Some of these just kind of quirky.
Tuesday.
Yeah,
some of these ended up in a distro deal with Columbia at some point, didn't they?
Oh yeah. I think
with Season to Risk. And
yep, exactly. Yeah. And so they would sign these quirkier Midwest bands. I think I mentioned it on some previous episode, but my band went up to showcase for them in Minneapolis because they loved one of our tapes. And we played one of our worst shows ever. And that was really disappointing for all of us. And anyway, so I'm aware of sheet metal. Let's get back on track. But thank you for that story because...
thank you, actually.
Because,
you provide a lot more context.
Cool you brought up sheet metal. Let's get into Anacrusis' second album, Reason. Now, we got an elephant in the room here. And this elephant is wearing mostly white T-shirts and sweatpants. Am I right?
You know
what
right.
I'm talking about here?
Yes.
Suffering Hour had a great cover. It was like just a dark, foggy, misty cathedral. And it was that was a photo taken by Kevin Heidbreder, the guitarist. It worked. After that, I'd be hard pressed to call any of the album covers good. Screams and Whispers is
I was about to say, I have a fondness for Screams and Whispers. I'm not sure I'd call it like great or anything.
No. Reason is straight up bad. And weirdly, it came out on 2 different labels in 2 different territories. I think it was on Axis or Active over in Europe, the way Suffering Hour was. And then by 1990, Metal Blade had picked them up for the second album and beyond. And both of the covers sucked, especially the US one with Metal Blade. It looks like just like a cheap Polaroid picture of the band, like just fucking, at a picnic in the evening, just... I don't know. I don't understand. Like, it doesn't have any power to it. Certainly not the way the music does.
No, it is in no way a reflection of the music.
And apparently all 4 of the records are coming out again on Metal Blade. There's a big reissue campaign. They did not redo the cover of any of these, especially Reason, which is, I don't know who's behind that, but whatever. You want to introduce the song we're going to play from Reason before I keep bitching about album cover artwork?
Yeah, shut up. Right now, we are going to get into 1990s Reason. We're going to start with the song that opens the album. It's called Stop Me. I think one of the most distinguishing elements here is the introduction of a very real sense of melancholy, which, in my opinion, underpins everything that the band did on this record and afterward.
Dude, we'll talk about Screams and Whispers when it's time, but that thing is just infused deeply with melancholy.
Yeah.
Almost so much so that I sometimes will have a hard time listening to it. But that's what's great about it as well. But yeah, back to Reason, you're absolutely right. This is the kind of the first time we get that, I think.
Yeah, I think so. It's still a much rawer Anacrusis than we're going to see on the next two albums. It's looser, I should say, too. There's like an organic sort of like band in the studio feel to this record and to Suffering Hour that I don't really feel like you get on the subsequent two records, which are clinical and extremely precise.
I think that's what makes Reason kind of that textbook definition transitional record, because you do get a band marching forward, not just the melancholy, but there's other elements we can talk about too. But it also has one foot in Suffering Hour with the rawness and still that guys in the jam room sort of vibe. Because as you say so rightly, you really don't get that on the next two. The next two are truly albums.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Also, I failed to mention this other guy. This Reason is produced by Ken Nardi, and then the band are credited after him, and then a guy named Sean McMahon. Don't know who he is, but do credit where it's due. Not their greatest production, but also a step up in terms of creativity with the songwriting, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting choice, Mr. Ginn. You picked that one.
I did. I mean, because it shows yet another shade of the band, and it shows, I think, another step in its evolution. It's plotting, it's dour, and I love that. I don't feel like you ever get another Anacrusis song quite like this one.
It's true. It's true. They would play with elements of this, certainly right. the melancholy and that slower pace. We hear a little bit of that Trouble influence sneaking in. There's two things that come to mind for me with Afraid to Feel. We start hearing non-metal influences come in, and we'll address that in a second. But we also hear the bass forward presence. You know, John Emery's really coming through there, and he continues to. And I think he's got a similar role in the band and a similar presence as Blackie from Voivod. Not to mention Voivod again, but Jesus Christ, come on. We can't help it. But it's there.
Have we mentioned Voivod every single episode?
99.8% of them, I think, yeah.
But you're right. It is there, and I would be hard-pressed to believe that these guys were not tuned into Voivod.
But yeah, the bass presence, let's speak to that. it's such a huge part of their sound going forward.
Oh, I would say that the aside from the very, I mean, like staggeringly innovative guitar language on the next two records,
Yep.
and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but like listening back to some of the stuff, and I listen to this stuff regularly. I mean, they're a band in regular rotation for me, but like going back and listening to this with a certain intent, if Manic Impressions were to come out today with an updated production, it would not sound dated in the least.
No, they were always a little bit futuristic in that sense.
Yeah, but you were dead on the money in terms of the importance of bass in this band. And there's no metal band that has quite the same approach to it as Anacrusis.
No, because he was carrying a lot of the melody. And he often gets these breaks. I think they wrote for him in a way where like, okay, here's a break and John's going to do his thing. And he's going to put brand new strings on his bass because it always sounded like he was using brand new strings. Like they're really steely sound, really the newness of strings. I mean, you know what that sounds like. And his was a tone that was just so cutting. And I applaud him and I applaud them for giving the bass such a presence, because this was not a subgenre of metal where you talked about bass very much.
Well, and I think it's also a nod to their post-punk influences. And you're talking about a band that put a cover of a New Model Army song on their third record. And they're like obviously deeply into The Cure, probably into a lot of the sort of more rock-focused post-punk bands like Chameleons, Sad Lovers and Giants, The Sound, bands where the bass played as much a role, at Joy Division maybe even, as the guitar. Like the guitar would, provide texture or melody, and the bass would like somehow buttress everything and kind of guide it. And like you say, the bass is not employed to that extent because clearly this is a metal band. Guitars are the voice of metal, but like bass in Anacrusis gets a much more dominant role than it does in most other metal bands.
Definitely. And what you're talking about with some of those post-punk influences, especially the more rock-oriented ones, you can hear that also in Ken Nardi's melodic choices in terms of his vocal delivery and the way he would write those melodic passages. I think that's coming from somewhere quite outside of metal.
Totally.
We'll probably hear a lot more of that as we move on to the last two records. Let's stick with Reason for what is, I think, probably most Anacrusis fans' favorite songs. I know it's one of yours and it's one of mine, Child Inside.
Oh, yeah.
hear a little bit of Paradise Lost sneaking in there at the end, but that would have been, of course, a precursor to Paradise Lost. But you know what I'm talking about? Again, the melancholy,
that wandering guitar, yeah.
And it creates that sort of gothic vibe. So there you go.
And there is always this sort of oblique gothic vibe that hovers over Anacrusis.
For sure. We mentioned how they were kind of ahead of their time. And I think in that sense they are too, because that, of course, became a lot more acceptable and a lot more common as a trait in metal going forward into the 90s. Actually, there's something that Kevin told me when I interviewed him for Mean Deviation. And he said something like in 91, which is where we're going to be now, because we're jumping to the third album, Manic Impressions. He said in 91, some record company executive said, the world isn't ready for Anacrusis yet. And he said that planted like a seed in their heads, that they had to get used to that and accept that they were on their own, you know?
Yeah, sure.
As they roll into the 90s. And I think that's kind of interesting because it just does point to how particular and peculiar they really were. And we get Manic Impressions, which is remarkable for a number of reasons. The two I think of immediately, the first one is the New Model Army cover at position number 2 on the album, and it works fantastically.
Well, again, it was like a decade before I knew that belonged to someone else.
That's just it. It doesn't jump out as a cover. It sort of
sounds
fits
like a
right
Anacrusis song.
Yeah, it fits right into the material. And the other thing is just the production of it, how sharp and steely and antiseptic it is.
There
in
is
a good
nothing
way.
like this.
Yeah, it's close to maybe like a Nothing Face in its cleanliness, but it goes even
I think
further.
It goes so much farther than that.
It goes even further, yeah. Let's just take a listen and behold a little bit, and we'll kind of assess it when we get back. This is a tune called Something Real. I think Something Real and pretty much this whole album is where you hear Ken becoming so artful with his use of the screech. It's so potent now, and it always arrives in the songs very well timed or well considered. And I think among the other facets of his delivery, he's just really an extraordinary vocalist, if we haven't made that known already.
No, he really is. And I think he really grows into, he's one of these guys that has a limited range, maybe limited technical facility, but like understands how to make the most of what he does have.
Oh, yeah.
He really just matures into a truly great vocalist as far as I'm concerned.
He's so good on these last two Anacrusis albums. And I think musically, the textures we hear in that song there, these ringing kind of kaleidoscopic layers. This is why it's my favorite Anacrusis album. I know that we could debate that back and forth forever because I think you're a Screams and Whispers man if pressed.
If pressed.
But yeah, it's just the recording, just everything about it is great. But we're kind of ignoring the guitars. What about the guitars on this album?
I don't know that there's another band in metal that has the same sort of approach to guitar harmony that Anacrusis does. And even just making the most out of the instrument. Even early on, they were using harmonics and dissonance and, open chords and really sort of exploring the full capacity of the guitar. And they continue to do that. And they continue to refine it. And I mean, I just think that those guys are like one of the really, truly exceptional dual guitar bands in metal. Up there with like Nasty Savage.
And I think of Trouble. And again,
great point. An
Anacrusis influence, but Rick Wartell and Bruce Franklin, when they would dive into the solo part, you knew who this was. You knew what band that you were listening to, and not just the leads, but even the rhythmic sensibilities and how they played off each other. Like it was just this tandem that it couldn't have been performed by another person with Rick or another person with Bruce. And I think it's the same way with Ken and Kevin. I think they play off each other so well throughout their discography, and especially on these last two albums. And the sound, by this time, Ken had just perfected this production and this Anacrusis sound where they sounded like no other, much less the delivery of what they were giving you that also sounded like no other. But like the guitars were like these cosmic razors or something. And they were played.
God, dude, I have to say, so Jeff is responsible for two future Canvas Solaris song titles. One being Fractured Ambushes, the other being Cosmic Razors. So thank you, Jeff.
Hey man, I'm building an EP for you at least. But yeah, that's how they come into me. If I'm in the listening room and I'm thinking aesthetically or texturally,
right?
They are these kind of cosmic razors, and they're played with such incredible finesse. And I think this is what makes Manic Impression so futuristic and so cosmic to me now. To jump to something else beyond that, to kind of extrapolate, I've always thought of Anacrusis music as very spacey or cosmic. It has that edge to it, but it's weird because thematically, their song titles and lyrics were total real life stuff, almost to the level of being like a hardcore band. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and earlier when we were talking about melancholy, I was thinking about Fate's Warning. And like that sort of oppressive realism.
Well, yeah, that's a good call. Yep. Personally, okay, I wish they always would have had a trippier Persuasion lyrically, maybe. Mm-hmm. But this band is so good, it hardly matters. It's hardly something I've thought about. But it's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. Given my druthers, I might prefer a different approach, but it sort of grounds it too. Because the music is so futuristic and so out, like vis-a-vis most metal, it kind of gives it like a human quality.
Yeah, no, I think it deepens their expression. I think it deepens what Anacrusis is, and it kind of sets them apart. Certainly. Let's listen to two in a row from Manic Impressions. We're going to listen to snippets of "Explained Away" and "Idle Hours." All right, man.
Yeah.
I'm liking what I'm hearing. I like this Anacrusis band.
It's a pretty good band.
Check them out.
You should.
Tell you what, that album features a drummer named Chad Smith, not the guy from Red Hot Chili Peppers, but another Chad Smith. Interestingly, he this is the only Anacrusis album he was on, and he's from St. Louis. But in 2005, he played on an album recorded by Geezer, the Geezer Butler, an album called Homework, which I have to admit, I've never heard, but I've heard other Geezer solo stuff. And I know that as much as I just treasure his role in Black Sabbath in every possible way, his solo stuff is just not my cup of tea.
Left Alone.
Left Alone? What's that?
No, I'm saying left alone to his own devices. Geezer Butler is not dependable.
Yeah, perhaps not. Chad Smith also played in 1994 with a band called Pavlov's Dog, which were like a 70s kind of art rock, kind of prog band, very high-pitched male vocalist, something I could never totally get into, but I feel like on paper I should. But interesting resume, man. Geezer, Anacrusis, and Pavlov's Dog. Very strange.
I'm glad he has Anacrusis.
He replaced Dean Castronovo in GZR, so that's interesting.
Who's a great drummer and a terrible human being.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He's a wife beater.
Oh, okay. Moving on. Chad Smith. No, but what do we hear there with Explained Away and Idle Hours? I mean, other than typical Anacrusis greatness, but this is quite a ways away now from Suffering Hour.
Oh man, yeah, totally. Angular, super clean, and two, like I think you get a certain differentiation between the instruments in this era of Anacrusis that we don't get earlier. Like every instrument has its place in the sound field now. It seems like almost kind of architectural. That's
a great way to put it. I've always thought of as maybe like sculptural.
Well, I mean, same thing. Yeah.
Same idea.
Yeah.
It's same idea. The architecture. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Anything to say about the album cover?
Not really. It's better than Reason.
It's better than Reason. It's one of those
it still sucks.
maybe a cool idea, but oops, the rendering itself is not great.
Yeah, no.
But yeah, we love this album. Plus, we're not even listening to like far too long.
Oh, we left a ton of stuff on the table.
You have to with this band. I mean, there's so much good stuff, but like Paint a Picture, the opening track is great. And of course, the New Model Army song, I Love the World. Really, really great cover. And, I will drop Voivod again because I think it's pertinent here. I Love the World fits into Manic Impressions the way Astronomy does into Nothing Face, where it doesn't sound like a cover. It fits with the material. It just seamlessly kind of interacts with the originals. And yeah, I think it's hard to do.
Oh, I mean, it's damn near impossible.
Yeah.
It's so rare to find, a sort of kinship where you can integrate it with that level of seamlessness.
Where it becomes your own, it's your own song. It's your album, and it fits there as the originals do. Yeah, it doesn't happen often, but it happened here. Anything else you want to say about Manic, or before we move on to Screams and Whispers?
Buy it.
Please do buy it. The reissues are coming out. I don't know a whole lot of detail. I hope they put them out on CD. I'm definitely assuming they come out on vinyl, but might be a good time to pre-order those things. Metal Blade has them all. We've been kind of circling around some Metal Blade lately, haven't we? Thought Industry.
We really have, yeah.
Well, it's Metal Blade. They're going to come up.
Yeah. They
had another band called Fate's Warning that we kind of like.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. Screams and Whispers.
Ancient.
What's that?
I'm sorry.
Did you just say ancient?
Yeah, I'm just being an asshole.
Well, beats the hell out of me. Moving right along, Screams and Whispers comes out in the magic year of, you want to say it, I know it.
1993.
Girl.
Come over here, girl. Let me tell you about a little year called 1993.
Let's check out Sound the Alarm. This was the lead-off track and also the video, and probably the one that most people know if they know this. And we'll confront what we're listening to here in a sec. Yeah, more wailing from Ken, man. Give it to me. I can't get enough of that stuff.
I love that he just keeps doing it. I mean, I really I love that he didn't sort of outgrow that. You know, like
that's
his clean voice became more and more developed over the years, but like he retained that early ferocity.
For sure. I mean, most of those kind of guys that start with pretty much 100% ferocity, or most of the time. We talked about Ken, of course, his early stuff being the dichotomy of clean to harsh. But yeah, he never dropped it. And most of those guys kind of do. And glad that he didn't. And it's just sounding more potent than ever. Something strikes me about Screams and Whispers, and it's, again, the production. I think this is such a production band when you get into the third and fourth albums, that this has the cleanliness and the sharpness of Manic Impressions, yet it's rounder and fuller at the same time.
It has much more depth, no doubt about that. There's a brittleness to Manic Impressions.
Totally.
And it kind of it's funny, like it sort of mirrors the cover. You know, the broken
with the
glass and everything. Yeah,
mirrors. Yeah, sure.
I never really thought about that until now, but.
Yeah, this works on all levels. This is a masterful album. I said I like Manic Impressions more. Sometimes that's just a thing of mood. I love this album. Not Sound the Alarm, but there's so many other tracks on this album that just kill me with the melancholy, though.
Picking tracks from this was so agonizing.
Yeah. That's why I gave the job to you.
I mean, really, it was very, very difficult for me to pick 3 songs.
Because there's too many prophets. There's Release. There's
the album's like kind of almost perfect.
I don't know why they tagged on the remix of Release at the end. That seems kind of like unnecessary, but it's there. But I think we can assume that the album ends with Brotherhood, the album proper anyway. Another great song. But no, you made some great picks. One of them is Tools of Separation, probably my favorite song on the album. I hope people hear why. Gorgeous, man. I love all that orchestral, gothic, strange,
That
textural.
Yeah, that is definitely one thing that we get on this album that we have not gotten before.
Yep. Yep.
And yeah, you're right, man. It's beautiful.
There's a lot of that throughout this album too. Like they do bring in that orchestral stroke quite a bit more.
Yep.
This album featured a guy named Paul Miles on drums. This was the only Anacrusis album he was on. And what is with these Anacrusis drummers and their weird resumes? Because he hasn't done a lot of other stuff otherwise, but he is credited with backing vocals on an Uphill Battle record. Now, this, you may, I know, right? You okay?
Oh my God. I didn't know that Uphill Battle needed backing vocals.
I didn't know Uphill Battle would ever be named on this podcast, but here it is.
Here we go, man.
Here we go.
They were like Marty Ritkonen's an Uphill Battle fan, I believe.
Perhaps they, I suppose so. They were on Relapse for a couple of albums. They are no more. They were kind of a metalcore meets grindcore band, and somehow Paul Miles ended up doing some backing vocals for this band, who I think are from California. So none of this makes any sense to me, man. I'm confused.
Yeah, no. God, that's so strange. He's a great drummer, though.
Oh yeah. Well, they certainly found guys in St. Louis to make it happen for sure. So hats off to Paul Miles and of course the rest of the guys.
Yeah, no, I absolutely adore his drumming on this record.
Let's check out another song. This is a bit from My Soul's Affliction. I like that we get more prominent John Emery there on bass.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, you get a very clear delineation of the instruments in that one.
So that's Anacrusis. That's a sampling of the 4 albums, a little overview. We do hope you buy all of this stuff. They failed to maintain the momentum, and it was tough times in 93, 94. I mean, no matter the quality of the material, everybody knows what was going on in the mid-90s for metal, and it was just hard for these kind of bands to find any traction. They were already cult-level type metal bands anyway. They just kind of faded. Ken Nardi said after they broke up, he spent some time recording still, really not having much purpose with the material, but he rearranged versions of older Anacrusis songs like Stop Me and Afraid to Feel, both of which we featured here, and a song called Far Too Long. He did arrangements for bass, drums, guitar, and acoustic guitar. And he says he combined them with full orchestral arrangements. I'm assuming that if he recorded anything, it was just, on the synthesizer or something like that, sampler. He said it could best be described as Slayer meets the Moody Blues, which I always find interesting.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, and then he came back eventually. I think the band did, I know the band did some reunion stuff, and I'm not sure. I think Kevin Heidbreder wasn't there for all of that. However, Ken had assembled a ton of material with the intention of putting out sort of a new Anacrusis album with the rest of the guys. Didn't totally pan out that it ended up being Anacrusis. John Emery is only on 4 tracks of the 28.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. So, and we're talking about the Ken Nardi solo album, Dancing with the Past. This was ultimately the thing that ended up coming out. It was supposed to be under the Anacrusis name. I have no idea if the Anacrusis album would have been 2 hours and 37 minutes long. As it is, that's how long the Ken Nardi album is. And I got to tell you, man, I love this album, but it's way, 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 way too long. It could have been 3 albums.
No, absolutely. It's like discouragingly long. But I had to take it in pieces. I always do. Like when I got it, like I listened to the first 10 tracks and got into those next 10 tracks.
That's about the way to do it. And I think if you selected your favorite 10 tracks, you'd have another great Anacrusis album, because the material itself is not far removed from Anacrusis.
Oh, not at all. It's
clearly the DNA of Anacrusis. I'm glad it exists. Our buddy Matt Rudzinski at Dive Bomb Records put it out in 2014. And some great moments on there if you can plow through it all. We selected 2. The second one is a song called Symbiotic that I think kind of echoes maybe his orchestral / Moody Blues comment.
Right.
That's definitely more in that vein. And then what I think is really the best song on the album, a thing called This Killer in My House. Let's check out both of these. This is from Ken Nardi's album from 2014.
You can tell based on these that Ken Nardi was the guiding light in Anacrusis, because you hear a lot of what he was building up to this point, and in fact, a lot of the music that was captured was recorded, and written between 1993 and 2011.
10, 11, yep.
Yeah, thereabouts. I mean, so yeah, and he was just kind of continuing along his way, like following his own voice. You hear the same melancholy, you hear the same inventive guitar playing, but you hear an increased reliance upon orchestral devices to sort of get that pain across.
Thankfully, he didn't drop the squeal, because we hear a little bit of that in Killer in My House. We hear it throughout the album. And that gives me some just great comfort to know that he still's got that.
Yes, absolutely.
Love the Ken Nardi squeal, man. If there's one takeaway from this episode, it's all about the squeal, baby.
All about the squeal, baby.
Thanks to listener Rob Hughes for his donation this past week. You can do that too. Just check the show notes on every episode going forward. We'll have an easy PayPal link for you if you care to do that. Please also write us at radicalresearchpodcast@gmail.com or hit the contact button at radicalresearch.org. Love to hear from all you freaks. Don't forget we have a blog section there. We haven't updated it too much in the past. Well, we haven't updated it much since we've started, but we will continue to try to find great material. I know Hunter's still working on his Solofold piece for that. We just got something from Dustin Donaldson of Thought Industry. We posted the first part. We will post a Q&A that Hunter and I did with him sometime next week, probably by the time you hear this. So please check that out as well. Next time, we are going to definitely take a bit of a left turn. We're going to go back into the prog world a little bit, quite a bit, for a show on, I guess, what's called the Canterbury scene or the Canterbury sound. This type of prog ranges from the whimsical to the wild, usually some level of weird. Its roots are in the 60s, and they spread amongst a geographic assemblage of bands who we'll touch upon in 90 minutes or so. A few names for you to know and remember until then. Soft Machine, Caravan, Egg, Steve Hillage, Quiet Sun. Who am I forgetting?
Hatfield in the North.
Hatfield in the North. National Health.
Oh, National Health.
Yeah, great stuff, man. Goodness. Some of the stuff will knock you out, we promise. Can't wait for Radical Research 35. That's going to be a lot of fun. Some really, really great prog delving for us and for you, hopefully, as well. See you then. Keep prog weird.